Do you think this is part of what we read in Peter when he's talking about how God formed the earth by water and through water? So it's almost as if he was using the actions of water in the very beginning.
Yeah, Peter is definitely pulling back from that in order to get the imagery to remind us that the world was created with water. And that by those waters, as Peter says, the world was then deluged and destroyed. And it's the waters of the world that destroyed the world at the time of the flood, and brought us to a point at the pinnacle of the flood story where it says, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days, and only Noah was left and those who were with him on the ark. The world is brought back to the same state at the middle of the flood that it was at the beginning of creation. It's this watery ball of unformedness with chaos going underneath as animals are being destroyed and buried and turned into fossils. But that's part of the whole point. God is resetting the world using Noah as a fresh representative of the human race, like Adam. He's preserving the animals. He's not going to remake them. God's not in the business of recreating the world after the flood. So we see the flood narrative pulls a lot from what's going on in Creation Week, but it does so in an interesting way.
Well, are there other clues in that Genesis history that helps us understand exactly how God then destroyed the earth?
Yeah, so we've got a geological clue in Genesis about what's going on. The fountains of the great deep break, the windows of heaven were open, so we have something going on geologically to rupture the planet, and that seems to trigger this massive and unusual rain onto the earth.
So we're not talking about the old nursery rhyme where just all of a sudden water, rain comes down.
Right.
Something horribly wrong, if you want to look at it from the standpoint of the people who are there, is beginning to happen.
That children's song doesn't get us around what the flood really was like. I tell my students that aside from the crucifixion accounts in the Gospels, Genesis 7 is the worst chapter of the Bible. Because if you read Genesis 7 for what it is, it's the systematic destruction of every single air-breathing, land-dwelling creature, man, woman, and child on the world. It's awful. And that should bring us to an understanding of what sin does to our souls. But in that still was mercy and opportunity for grace, because God never pulls away his grace from people. He reached out, he became a man so that he could make that grace complete.
And that's what I was overwhelmed with in the Grand Canyon as I was looking at those layers, because what struck me was even though those layers are absolutely gorgeous, especially at sunset, they represented this destruction, the judgment of God, and the life that was destroyed. And as Peter says, if you miss that, you'll probably miss that God is going to destroy the world again as a result of sin.
Yeah, Peter's use of the flood is important because he's got two very short epistles. I mean, they're not long, and he uses the flood 3 times in those 2 epistles to illustrate important theological truths. And each time he does it, it hinges on Noah and the flood being real events. And he actually couples them also not only with Jesus' return, as you said, but also with creation. So what you've got are 3 events that Peter is linking together: the creation of the world, the destruction of the world, and the return of Jesus Christ for the second destruction. And the force of Peter's argument is contingent on the flood being a historical event. It's not one of those things where he's using it as an illustration, it could be mythological or what. No, the reason that we know that judgment will happen in the future is because judgment happened in the past.
Well, and not only does the flood help us understand that nature and aspect of God, the holy nature of God, as he judges sin, and understanding that God destroyed it then, that he will destroy it again. But it's the record of that flood that also then helps us understand the world around us and the facts and the geology, the paleontology that you are engaged in. Without that reference of the flood, you wouldn't have that eyewitness as to what it is you're really seeing.
No, and that's what Peter was helping to remind the Jews at the time that he was writing, that this is a singular event that was so utterly and completely different from everything else. That's why we know that Jesus' return is going to be an actual event that is completely and utterly different from everything else. History builds upon itself, and God does not forget the history that he has done, and he will use his prophets and his apostles to remind us of those histories.